Hey there, this is Gail Gallagher. You might know me as the host of Faith in What Resonates, and this is a special episode of our show, Blessed Lunatics, where we are talking about the war in Ukraine. So I had a couple things to touch base on before we jump into the conversation. One, this is a raw conversation between friends, so expect the language to veer in that direction accordingly. Like, we're gonna swear and stuff, you know. And also, I realized we never fully introduced ourselves in our conversation. You are going to hear from me, Gail Gallagher. I'm a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church, and then we have Father Andrew Miller, who is of the Old Catholic Celtic Rite Church. We have Reverend Michelle Byerly, who is of the United Methodist Church, and we have Wesley Morrison-Sloat, who is a UU layperson. And together we run New Faith, New Media, and this conversation is our space to process everything that is going on and hopefully help our audience have some of that space as well. So anyway, here we go.
Welcome to another episode of Blessed Lunatics, dear listeners. Now, this episode is going to be a little different than what we usually do in a couple of ways. First off, because we usually make Blessed Lunatics for our Patreon supporters, whereas this episode is going to be available on our general feed. And the reason why we're going to do it this way is because we're going to be talking about a topic that we believe is very, very important, and that is, of course, the war in Ukraine. And it's important, we feel, to do public theology, to reflect upon events in the news from a theological perspective, because they're not just abstractions. They're not just things that are happening in a far off land. People are really being hurt, and people are really being affected by them. And it's important to think about that theologically. Furthermore, as Karl Barth, one of my favorite theologians, says, it's important that we fight the good fight with the Bible in one hand, or whichever scripture you prefer, and the newspaper in the other. So with that in mind, we'll begin our discussion on the war in Ukraine.
This is Wesley. Sorry, this is Wesley. I'm going to start this. I'm sure everyone has seen some form of this or another, and I'm sure this is difficult. This is going to be a continuing struggle, just as it's important to use everybody's preferred pronouns as a form of respect. Most people are probably used to using the Russian transliterations from Cyrillic into the Latin alphabet, and we are just now learning to use the Ukrainian transliterations from Cyrillic into the Latin alphabet, and thus the Ukrainian pronunciations. So remember that the capital is not Kiev, it's Kyiv. I don't know of any of the other cities, but if any of us mispronounce Kyiv as Kiev, somebody else please gently remind, and nobody self-flagellate, just say I'm sorry and move on.
I would also like to add, just because things are shifting and changing, that we are recording this on the night of Friday, March 4th.
And as of Friday, March 4th, I believe Kherson has fallen to the Russians, one of the major cities. Most of the others are under attack. A Russian convoy attempted but failed to encircle Kyiv. Oh, by the way, something I found, I was listening to a Ukrainian sort of giving one of those instructional videos on how to pronounce it, and it's actually not Kyiv either, it's Kyiv. There's sort of a U that kind of a U sound that kind of merges in with the E, so it kind of sounds to the Western ear like Kyiv, but it's Kyiv. So Kyiv, right. Sort of like blend it all together.
Right. Sort of like how so many African languages can pronounce NG at the beginning of a word, and Western languages had so much trouble with that. And I actually have spent many an hour practicing how to say ng at the beginning, African and Eastern Asian languages. It's actually kind of fun, but I'm a linguist nerd.
Yeah. So I think it might be helpful for those of our listeners who aren't as familiar with kind of how we got to where we are. I think it is good to kind of look at some of that history of, the shifting political landscape that happened after World War I and II. With, you had the Russian Empire that would have included parts of what we call Ukraine and yeah, all of it. And then you have the basically the internal civil war that happens right around World War I, as people are getting less and less satisfied with being involved in that fight, and with Tsar Nicholas II and all of that. And then later on, you get the formation of the Soviet Union that then later broke apart. And so I think when we talk about language and culture, I think that it's important to remember that that is the fabric and the framework that is underneath all of this, and that we are talking about people that are involved. And I guess I say that to say part of what distresses me so much in war is the people that it affects. And I, not that I struggle with, I don't want to do a both sides thing, but my heart does go out to the moral injury and to some of the folks on the Russian side who are involved in something they never wanted to be involved in.
Well, I don't think it's both sides to suggest that, in spite of the fact that the Russian invasion is entirely unjust, that there are aspects of the Russian narrative that they have a point about. For instance, if you look at Russia, they're surrounded. The West is not surrounded. The Russians are surrounded by potential enemies on all sides, and have been throughout the course of their history. Secondly, there is truth to the claim that Ukrainians and Russians are very culturally similar. Historically, however, the notion that therefore Ukraine it's not a real country, but has always been a part of Russia. No, they've always been dominated by Russia, or have for a large part of their history been dominated for various reasons. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you brought the history, because there's an interesting part of World War I when the Bolsheviks were attempting to pull the Soviet Union, the fledgling Soviet Union, out of World War I. I don't think they called it the Soviet Union just yet, but the Bolsheviks had just attained control of Russia. And they were trying to pull Russia out of World War I. And they signed a treaty with Germany to do that. That was very punitive, that redrew the boundaries of Russia in a way that was just unbelievable. Took away a third of their land and ceded it to Germany. And Russia at the time was much larger than it is now, and it's still the largest country in the world. And if you look at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is the treaty that ended World War I in the East, with a German victory, the borders of Russia look very similar to what that treaty imposed upon it since the collapse of the USSR. So from their mindset, they have been imposed upon by the West largely since 1919. And historically speaking, it was the West that was the invader, not so much the Russians. Now, all that said, Russia is a far more powerful country with a far larger military. Invading, I would say, unprovoked, in an unprovoked fashion, invading a smaller, less powerful nation. There's nothing justified about that.
Yeah. I mean, from our credo of siding with the oppressed over the oppressor, it's clear that we must side with Ukraine over Russia. Mm-hmm. That being said, I mean, one of the common memes going around, because as I said, I've said so many times before, I live on the internet, like all these people saying, this is unprecedented, this is clear. It's like, this may be clear, but it's not unprecedented. I mean, Yemen is clearly being oppressed and attacked by Saudi Arabia, and it's clearly one side justified to defend itself against another. Palestine is clearly being oppressed and attacked by Israel. We don't talk about those.
Yeah.
And
that
we
leads
are on the wrong side of those.
and I was going to say, and that leads to the question, why don't we talk about those?
Because Ukrainians are white
And
people.
I would,
And there it is.
Yeah.
There's on the other hand, if we agree that Ukraine is justified in defending itself, and I think we ought to, then that does open up a discussion on the theological topic of just war theory versus pacifism. Of course, that's a very, very simplistic way of looking at it, and I have some reflections along those lines. For instance, a lot of times just war theory posits a hypothetical war that has never happened.
Can you break down like what does sort of what just war theory is and like where it came from? Like, just dial it back a little bit.
Sure. So just war theory is a theory in theology in which the goal of it is to put forth a war in which a Christian, and it comes out of Christianity, but it can be engaged in by other religious traditions as well, in which a Christian can engage. So the early Christians were probably pacifists, willing to die rather than to engage in warfare at all, right? Of course, as Christianity found itself more and more in the mainstream of Roman imperial culture, well, at the heart of Roman imperial culture is a tremendous amount of violence, not just in like open warfare, but well, there's violence at the heart of this thing we call the state, right? The state, the monopolizer of the use of violence, right? So in order to participate in culture, it necessitated the participation of Christians in violence. And so Christians had to think about whether that was justified, on what grounds was it justified. And the prevailing conditions of just war theory as they tend to be put out are one that the war must be openly declared by a governing authority, it must have a just cause, it must be for the defense of the common good, and it must use means that that can be justified by the ends, right? It use
proportional response,
proportional response, right? Not overwhelming response. Well, there has never been a war in history where that has been met. Never. So just war theory, one of my critiques of just war theory, although I am not a pacifist, is that it plays with hypotheticals. It doesn't play with reality. I mean, it says, all right, what kind of violence hypothetically would be a kind of violence that we could get on board with, as opposed to dealing and reflecting on the violence that already exists and is prevalent in our culture.
And as far as theologians who delved into this issue, I think you want to look at Richard and Reinhold Niebuhr.
Yes.
They were brothers who they did, and they each kind of took various perspectives on just war theory, and I can imagine sitting around their dinner table would have been quite interesting. So
yes, a lot of the famous just war theorists include St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Reinhold Niebuhr, though not H. Richard Niebuhr. A number of pacifists include folks like maybe Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, although he was willing to participate in an attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. And well, there's a large tradition of Christian pacifists, Anabaptists, Quakers.
So it's just to try to put it in easier words. It was largely a theoretical theology conversation, and then when you apply it to actual war, people are complicated.
Yes. Right. And like, I think this is where I would bring the Jewish theology in. It is that ultimately you can have all the complicated theology talk you want, but in the end, it's about living in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
That religion is great, but religion has to be more about making the world better and less about complicated conversations.
I'm glad you brought that up, Wesley, because on the one hand, my critique of just war theory is, I said, it's dealing in abstraction and doesn't deal with reality. On the other hand, one of my critiques of pacifism, all right, so I greatly admire you, O Amish, in being, consistent with your principles. On the other hand, the security that grants you the ability to live out your principles is provided by people who are willing to engage in violence. And that's what led Dietrich Bonhoeffer to realize I can, in good conscience, commit an act of violence against Adolf Hitler if given the opportunity. Because
and also ultimately that being willing to commit small acts of violence in carefully thought out instances might be the more pacifistic option than refusing to commit any violence, which leads to a more violent world.
Right.
I'm not saying that, which is why that also long, complicated philosophical conversations have their place. As long as they lead you to better action.
There's a difference, I feel, between the moral calculus of deciding to commit violence in self-defense and deciding to commit violence in other defense. So for instance, if someone's holding a gun to my head, courage not failing, and I put it that way because I never had a gun to my head, not literally, like courage not failing, I would hope that I would have the strength to say, all right, I'd rather take the bullet than poison my soul and yours with violence, right? On the other hand, if someone holds a gun to my daughter's head, or if someone holds a gun to the heads of say millions upon millions of Jewish persons in Central Europe, at that point the moral calculus becomes a lot different, because then it's not just then my pacifism really becomes privileged ego, right? At that point, and I realize that World War II was not fought to liberate the Jews. I get that, but that's what it did. And well, I'm sorry, but if you tell me that millions upon millions of Jewish people at all are being held prisoner in concentration camps, my moral response is, all right, guys, we're coming. So, and maybe that's a masculinist patriarchal response, but that's my response. It's like, fuck, let's go kick ass.
Yeah.
Right.
That
And like I think of the people working to smuggle the artwork out of the Louvre, that they had absolutely no right to ask others to do that work, and they didn't. But they showed amazing moral courage to risk themselves to do it, because that work was worth saving. And if that work had been taken, if those works had been taken back to Germany, to Nazi Germany, it would have been used for horrible propaganda purposes. But no painting is worth a life not freely given. So the museum workers chose to risk themselves, and the underground workers chose to work with them to get those paintings and sculptures to safety. But they did not ask others to help. And we've gotten distracted from the issue of Ukraine.
Well, I will say that I'm very, very inspired by the actions of the Ukrainians in this crisis.
Yes.
No. Giving packets of sunflower seeds.
That is a moment of badassery.
Can you unpack that story?
I'm retelling it from memory, so it's not real great, but it sounds like that there was this woman who gave packets of seeds to the Russian invaders. It was kind of as a forget you kind of thing, but it's a subtle act of it's still spreading beauty, and it's kind of saying, I hope that these, if I remember correctly, it was kind of, I hope these grow over your grave kind of thing, is how it came to. And the sunflower is the symbol of Ukraine.
I've watched the video a couple times, and she straight up tells them "fuck you" over and over again, and she says, and it's a they've said it every time it's a tradition in Ukraine that the women give packets of sunflowers to soldiers invading their country. And they tell them, you are invaders, you are unwelcome here. Carry these seeds in your pocket so that when you're killed, they will grow on your grave.
It almost has this, like, I don't want to say it's like a turn the other cheek. I think it's like, but it's also kind of just like, I don't know.
It's a beautiful subversive resistance.
It's a subversive resistance. It's very like, yeah, it's yeah, no.
Which oddly enough is what turn the other cheek is.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Okay, cool. That's what I was poking at.
But the thing that I like about it is that the video that I saw takes it to another level, because the soldier keeps saying back to her, "Now, all right, I've listened to you. Don't make this worse." And she, every time he says that to her, she goes, "How could this be worse?" And then just keeps talking. And then he'll say, "Now, don't make this worse." And she goes, "How could this be worse?"
That's a good segue into how the Russians are handling this, because it strikes me that Russian, because I've seen that video, that Russian's heart is not into it. That Russian does not want to hurt that woman. And there, to the great credit of the Russian people, there has been massive resistance to this war, even among very surprising sectors within the Russian government.
Resistance.
To the point that they are now controlling the social media to tamp that resistance down.
Yeah, but like, I want to make the point. People talk about, like, this isn't medieval times anymore. The king does not control what the people say to each other. The king never controlled what the people said to each other. That has never been the truth. We were talking about Hamlet before the show started, but I want to go back to Richard III. When the king screws up, the people depose the king. It has always been true. When the people screw up, when the king screws up enough, the people walk into the throne room, pick him up, and throw him out the window. I mean, like, one of my favorite phrases from history is the defenestrations of Prague. It's like, to the point where there's a phrase for there's a phrase for when people get thrown out the window. Defenestrations.
Yeah. So
and yeah, okay, Michelle, talk. I've talked long enough.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to talk over you. So what then do we make of?
But I realized I hit 30 seconds.
So what then do we make of? There's been one of our U.S. senators. I'm not going to say the name, but I think we've heard the name. Maybe made a comment about someone should just assassinate Putin, and everyone has kind of has really dogpiled against that. So what do we make of that in all of this?
Why are they dogpiling? Is it for practical reasons or is it for moral reasons? Because from a moral perspective, yeah, I'm rather okay with that.
Yeah, I think it's more the pragmatic.
Yeah, I mean, bingo. We can't get to him. I mean,
no.
And if we tried, it would make the situation worse.
Well, and that's it more of like the fear of reprisal and setting off more than we really want to face.
Yeah.
Because then would that be a little bit like the Archduke Ferdinand situation?
Yeah, it's such a tenuous situation, like that. Just like, yeah, that feels like a like it's such it feels like such an intense and like just not it feels so like such an incorrect choice that it's like, oh, you said the quiet part out loud. Like, let's, we're feeling that, but it is more nuanced than that. Like, we do not want to, like, which is part of it.
But I think this is one of the very, very few times where the moral and the practical actually line up. That morally, people deserve to choose their own government. And practically, choosing governments for other people doesn't work. When you choose governments for other people, what happens? Either the government topples in 6 months and there's a huge mess left behind, or a dictator who lasts way longer than it should. Either way, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I think
if we wait for them to topple Putin, what happens? A much more functional Russian government is left behind.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's a good point. That if we kill Putin ourselves or invade Russia ourselves, then, well, at the end of the day, we're just doing another type of regime change, which is maybe we're more justified than they are in Ukraine, maybe not, but we're doing something very similar to what the Russians are doing in Ukraine at that point. But if the Russians were to kill Putin themselves, why, at that point, I got to say, I'm Lord forgive me, I'm rather okay.
I think if Ukraine killed Putin, that would be part of making war. That would be part of self-defense. If the United States assassinated Putin, no, that'd be regime change. If anybody in the EU assassinated Putin, it'd be a regime change. I'm sorry. I might have misunderstood what you were talking about.
I guess I heard you as asking more of a question on the general ethics of political assassinations, and yeah, that's a tough one.
Like if we were going back to Inglourious Bastards, assassinating Hitler, I took that as a legitimate act of war. Assassinating the leader of a country you're at war with, I see that as if they're the commander-in-chief of your army, then I see that as just the same as killing any other soldier or general or anything else.
It's like capturing the king in chess.
Right. If they're part of the command structure of the army, if they're the commander-in-chief, then they're a soldier. They're not a civilian. They're a legitimate target. So I see if Ukraine were to assassinate Putin, go for it. Us, EU, Ethiopia, no. Then it's regime change, which goes back into the slippery ickiness of just war, which, why don't we get some slugs and put them on our faces?
So another aspect of this that we kind of hinted at before our conversation, you talk about living on the internet, or we hear these stories, how do we kind of deal with sitting in the suck of it in some ways, that existential terror, the whatever. And I guess this is almost to the listener as much as anybody. How are you truly doing with this? How do we talk through this?
That is exactly what that was exactly the point that I was wanting to segue to, Michelle. So thank you
for it.
Yeah. And I don't have an answer for that. I am the sort of person, and I'm sure some of our listeners are in this position as well, but I'm the sort of person where when things like when these situations are happening and you're just like taking this massive download of in your brain of all of the horrors of it, like I have to just set like I clear boundaries of like when I'm taking stuff in and when I'm distancing myself and really focusing on what is here. Because I just you know, feel all of it. And I don't like necessarily say like I'm an empath because like that's kind of like loaded. But I, you know, like but I am somebody where I think of the people first. I don't do large I struggle with larger historical conversations, and I like to say I'm a biographer, not a historian. And so I really think of like the individual stories and the individual like lives that in, and it's hard for me to process the scale of it all. Yeah, and then as a person who lives on the internet and has a platform as an artist, giant scare quotes, it's like I don't know how to weigh in on this. I don't know how to have a statement about this. I am not going to talk about it, and I feel like what Wesley said about like no activism is better than bad activism, like I like everybody's processing differently, but it's just like I'm not going to stick a Ukrainian flag on my profile picture and call it a day. This is a war, not a chain letter. I will be in my corner working on a puzzle and trying to articulate how I feel. And I don't want to feel like I'm not being supportive because I'm not saying anything about it on social media. So I'm saying things about it on a podcast. But, you know, like...
This is all an abstraction to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. 2 quotes I wanted to highlight before I forget them. This is a war, not a chain letter. I loved that.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you sit in the suck? I liked that one a lot too.
What is the suck for us as Americans? What suck? I think there is a suck. I'm not saying there isn't one, but it is odd that we talk about. But I think it's odd that we talk about sitting in the suck when, well, we're in probably the safest place in the world right now.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing I kind of wrestle with a little bit is, you know, how much you're right, Gail, of like, is it just kind of like hashtag kind of thing of putting it on our profiles, and it doesn't really affect us all that much. I think there are the impacts that we feel in the sense that we belong to this global community, and that, you know, we do notice these things more than we used to because of the interwebs and those things that do bring us closer to seeing those stories and to seeing those individuals in ways that we never may have before.
Yeah, like the internet is the place where we plug in with this global community, and yet the social dynamics of social media are so like quick and superficial and, you know, just trying to grab attention, when this is a conversation that requires nuance and depth and sitting in the suck and taking the time to have that conversation. And it's not that, I guess, as I'm talking it out loud, it's like not that I don't want to talk about it, but I worry like what is the appropriate platform to talk about it, and the appropriate way to process. And, you know, and yes, you want to be reminded of it, but like the actual act of like scrolling through social media and seeing like cat photo, everything's on fire, you know, that whole Bo Burnham, like, can I interest you in everything all of the time? That is bad for your brain. So,
yes,
like,
well,
we have to take care of ourselves, you know?
And I was trying to find it before we started recording, and I couldn't. But there was this Tumblr post from someone that I came across, and I read it to my mom because she got a little doom scrolly about Ukraine, and I was trying to get her just stop. But it started with this line that just got me in the gut. That was, "Oh, my most beloveds." And I was like, I might starting sermons with that. Just greeting the congregation with, "Oh, my most beloveds." Because like that the story of the baptism of Christ, when the heavens open up and the Spirit of God descends like a dove, and the voice of God booms out, "This is my son my beloved son with whom I am well pleased." That line has also gotten me. But then it went on, and it talks about anxiety is not activism. If you can go out and do something good, do it. If you can't, at least stop making yourself anxious. Because anxiety is not activism.
It's that line from Come From Away. I need something to do because I can't watch the news anymore. Like, it's exactly that.
Yes.
There's a sense in which I guess for me, and this is my own psychology, but part of the reason why and I'm not justifying my doom scrolling, I shouldn't, but I do, doom scroll, that is. And I think part of the suck of the situation for me is that there's a sense in which it is very, very possible that the Ukrainian conflict, which is an abstraction for me as an American right now, could at some point become not an abstraction, because there's a very real chance that it could go from a war between nuclear armed Russia and a non-nuclear armed Ukraine to a war between a nuclear armed Russia and a nuclear armed United States. NATO forces are going into the Baltic states right now, and I think they should. But for instance, if Russia invades Ukraine and we all become very angry and start sanctioning and sending weapons to Ukraine, Russia invades Latvia and we're at war because they're a part of NATO and we're treaty bound to it. And that means we're going to war as a nuclear armed country against Russia, the country with the most nuclear weapons in the world. Now, nuclear war is a subject that is exceedingly bleak, and this war sucks enough. A nuclear war, one spot's as good as the next. Doesn't matter whether we're in Ukraine or here. So,
yeah, and like my mom, doom scrolling, was talking about the fact that my sister's boyfriend, who is a wonderful person and we love him, and he's in the army.
I mean, and that's, yeah, how do we acknowledge that this is something that could affect us, like Andrew was saying, and kind of back to our question of what do we say, what do we do? I wrestle with that, not just as an individual, but as someone who claims to have some level of spiritual leadership in a faith community. I try to anyway.
And you're a minister.
I mean, and that's the thing. It's like there's always been this debate in the church of, how much should the church say about politics? What is political or not? There's the very good argument to say that Jesus was political in his way. There's I'm a very strong believer that the personal is political. So when you say,
right.
So in that regard, what affects one person affects everybody. And to recognize also that these are the, other people are out there doom scrolling, and how do I walk with them in the midst of that? I
guess the thing for me that got fake, what is the church, what did the Apostle Paul, what was his first thing that he taught the church to do for each other and for the neighbors around them?
Pray.
All right, the second thing.
Gather resources.
Feed each other.
Yeah.
Gather resources and share them. Feed each other. I firmly feel that any church, any congregation that isn't feeding themselves and each other and the people around them who is not a true church. And if you if you're feeling anxiety about the world, if you're feeling anxiety about world events, bake, can. You can put up resources in heaven and at the same time put up resources in your pantry.
I was gonna say something really quickly about an experience that I actually had at my church the Sunday after the war began. I was not okay. I was terrified. I kept and I know that this is not rational of me. This is an irrational fear. But as I was driving into Kansas City for church, I kept looking for the white light. I kept looking for listening for the siren, listening for that thing on the phone, the presidential alert thing that Trump started, right? And I know that's not going to happen. Not it's not going to happen that way. If it does, and it's going to be months of it anyway. But I was terrified. I was just absolutely terrified as I drove into church, and I was canting. I was a cantor that day, and the music director of our church notices me, and I'm just kind of doing my thing. I'm trying to be as normal as possible, but he notices me and is like, "Andrew, are you okay?" "Oh yeah, I'm fine." "No, you're not." And he took me aside and we talked. It was a really, really nice, genuinely kind thing to do. He took me aside and it's like, no, come here. Before Mass, we're going to talk. And we talked, and I felt so much better afterwards.
Yeah. And I think that's also a very important thing. Whatever your faith background, whatever your cultural background, if someone says they're fine and they're not, don't let them get away with it.
I think it's important that we hope. I think anxiety is not activism, but true hope is. And by true hope, I mean the following: hope of action, confident expectation that leads you to action, not a wish, but a confident expectation that leads you to action. And one of my favorite theologians is Jürgen Moltmann, who was a Lutheran theologian who began his work during Cold War, and one of his points was, all right, look, Catholic ethics has come up with a very, very sound theology of love through Christian or Protestant theology has come up with a very, very sound theology of faith, and he's thinking about Kierkegaard a lot there. But what is needed now in a world with nuclear annihilation is a theology of hope. We have to assert against hope. We have to hope against hope that we're going to be here tomorrow, and that needs to lead us to action. That needs to lead us to build to go out there and do. And if we don't do that, if we don't have that hope, then we exist in this anti-Christian despair, and a nuclear war becomes certain.
Very good. And that's where my place of baking was this week, was my church, Second Unitarian of Omaha. We are working with Lutheran Family Services to support a Afghan refugee family that was evacuated from Kabul. The Unitarian Universalist Association is a very, very action-driven, hope-driven denomination, but we're also very small. So when we do something, we usually are doing it in cooperation with someone else. And Lutherans, driven by a theology of hope, have Lutheran Family Services. So we were working with them. And this weekend, we're moving them into two apartments because they're a large family. And we finally found them in 2 apartments in the same complex. It took a while. They've been in Omaha since December. It is the first weekend of March, and they're finally getting to where they're going to be. And I can't help with the move because I am in a strict quarantine, so I don't get bronchitis for the 8th time in 18 months. And but it occurred to me, because I've moved a lot, that nobody ever thinks to provide food and drink for the movers. So I called the people in charge of the move and said, "Did you think to provide food and drink for the movers?" And they're like, "No, we didn't. That's a good idea." So I took that upon myself. And then I got to chatting with them more, and they said, yeah, they've been being shuffled between hotels and the hostels in church basements and stuff since December. And I'm like, well, that sucks. So I decided to do some more research and call and make some more calls. And I called Tara, who's a friend of New Faith New Media, and asked her to research halal junk food and candy. And she made a trip and bought like 3 bags of stuff, which includes Twizzlers because they thicken with pectin instead of gelatin. So just a thing so people know. And I baked rolls, and I called Sarah, who's another friend, who has a little orchard on her family's farm, and she got 9 jars of canned peaches and fruit chutney and apple butter, and I made rolls. So that even if the family doesn't get their kitchen set up, they can have some fun stuff to eat this weekend. And it was a concerted thing that I could do, that at the end of the day, something good was done. And it wasn't doom scrolling.
What do we think are some of the unhelpful ways of responding to the Ukrainian crisis?
Banning Russian blues from cat shows.
Go on.
Well, the cat version of the American Kennel Club declared that they couldn't sit back and do nothing in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So they banned Russian blues and all other Russian breeds from cat shows.
Dum 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 dum.
Yep, which is definitely an example of bad activism being worse than no activism.
Yeah.
Which by the way, listeners, is a modification of the saying "bad D&D is worse than no D&D" or Dungeons and Dragons.
But also, it's a very
that's
good
my nerd leak, which is my nerd leaking into my theology, which I encourage everyone to let happen. So,
yeah, that's I mean, this points what I was saying. It's a war, not a chain letter, and I think that like social media can and just sort of the act of being a public figure, like there's just a lot of weird like obligations and shoulds that you feel on how you can address situations. And like I think some of it comes from feeling like you want to have some control and you want to be able to do something, and you feel so distant and you want to sort of do something with the anxiety of it all, and so you just like grab onto the first thing because that's what you have time for. Or in the case of this cat show, it's like it's that weird like purity adjacent to like somewhere between cancel culture and freedom fries, an American memoir, but somewhere between cancel culture and freedom fries. Where sorry, this is my squirrel brain. But no, so like this feeling of somewhere between cancel culture and freedom fries, where you feel it's more about how do I save face, how do I address anything that could possibly be problematic. But it's like that doesn't do anything. That's just you being anxious to make sure that you're doing the cat show right.
Thoughts and prayers.
Thoughts and prayers.
Right.
Like it's
not
even
performative.
It's performative. Exactly. It's performative. And so it becomes more about performance and less about like
Seems like Wednesday's scripture in Christianity this week was all about do not when you pray, do not go around going on and on like the Pharisees do, and do not. And yet we also talk about wearing ashes on our foreheads. So anyway,
well, that's okay. I didn't. Y'all. Okay, you're pointing at the Ash Wednesday scripture. I was just like, wait, there's like a weekly. Wait, go on.
Yeah.
Like,
no, it's the Ash Wednesday.
Yes.
start of Lent in the Christian calendar.
Yes.
You know.
Also, I should say, full disclosure, listeners, if you're like, gee, Gail sure talks a lot about social media, that's because I'm on my nonsense again for Lent, and I'm like, my Lent project is a social media project, so everything is through that lens. Welcome to my world. Anyway, yeah, but it's this performance, and it's not about you, and we don't want to center ourselves in it. It's about what's happening over there. And so much of having a platform is like, here's my hot take. And it's like, this is bigger than that. You know?
Yeah.
Right.
I like your phrasing of centering it on the people around whom it's centered.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
There's a I've come, I never understood as I would study the history of the Cold War, why it was in the early 80s that there were so many people in the Reagan orbit, not so much Reagan himself, but in the Reagan orbit on the right, who were so unafraid of nuclear war. Whereas you watch like the show The Day After, which is so bleak, and like, well, nothing is worth that. And then when I analyzed my emotional responses to Ukraine and how angry I was at Russia and how much I think I got it. There is a certain comfort in nationalism, and there is a certain comfort in the stupid, this utterly stupid feeling that, well, if there's a nuclear war, at least we're on the right side. Dumbass.
Yeah.
But I felt it. I felt that comfort. I was like, yeah, let's put troops into the Baltic states. Let's stare him down, man. If he's gonna come after us, we're gonna knock him back, and we're all gonna die, but we're gonna be right. Darn it! And it's like, you idiot.
Is that like Dr. Strangelove riding in on the bomb?
Yes. Yeah. No.
Yeah.
But it was like that's an that there's your that's my unhelpful way of thinking about it. That's what I did. That was odd and bad.
I want that to be like a phase of like the phases of grief, or like the phases of processing war is the Doctor Strangelove phase.
We've all seen that movie.
Well,
right?
but
yes.
But that's all of those phases happen in that movie. So what's the character, that cowboy guy who rides that
Slim
bomb?
Pickens.
Yeah.
The actor's
Slim
name is Slim
Pickens.
Pickens. Major Kong is the character's name.
Major Kong. Okay. But I've been watching MASH with my mom, and Major Burns, who is so dumb for one, but is also that horrible nationalistic, uber patriotic dumbass.
Mm-hmm.
And like he literally says the line at one point, like, "Why are you bothering to learn Korean? We're American." And Hawkeye looks back and goes, "We're in Korea." And yeah, but we're Americans. We can go wherever we want, and people will speak American. And like everybody just sort of looks at him for a second, and like, should we look at each other? And you can see the thought going back and forth. Should we remind him that we don't speak American, we speak English? And then they're just, no, just let it go. And then like later, a little bit later in the episode, there's the moment where they're surrounded by Koreans and none of them speak English, and they have to get by with the phrases that they memorized earlier in the episode. And Frank is absolutely no help. But also, like, there's so many times that he gets them into trouble. And MASH is all a satire of American imperialism and the futility of war and all that crap. But it was just, yeah.
I think there are things that we can do to express hope in little ways, and the sense that every child born after 1945 is an expression of hope. Because why the hell have children if you don't believe that they're going to have a future? And why the hell go to work if you don't believe that there's no point in saving up money for a better life? Why the hell make a list of the things that you get up in the morning and you do? and all the rituals, all the the hygiene, so you don't smell bad in front of your colleagues. What's the point of it all if you don't have a
Well,
profound sense of hope that you're gonna
I
live?
would counter. We have kids for the straight people because we're horny.
Fair enough.
We get up. We go to work so we don't starve. Because hunger is pretty motivational.
I suppose.
We brush our teeth because toothaches suck. In our modern capitalistic hellscape, a lot of it's just because the agony, the alternative agony, is worse. Gotten to a weird place. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that went. I mean,
it's
Yeah.
and
it's not a carrot. It's not a carrot and a stick anymore. It's like, would you rather be beaten with the 8-tailed lash or the 12-tailed lash?
I suppose you could choose to see it that way, and I suppose that you can choose to see it another way. So
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of speaking to my own like personal definition of hope and faith and whatnot is one the I've been very much tracking my own personal journeys with grief and life knocking me on the butt and all this stuff. So I have a very like sensibility of just like I wake up each morning and I'm just like, it is another day. I am focused on what is here now. I celebrate the joy because a lot has sucked. But so there's that element of joy and hope after having some heavy, shit. But then also I find that there's a lot of like I have this general sensibility of like faith in humanity and faith in growth. And like as a teacher, I get to practice that every day because when you're working with people who are and they're working on like basic skills of like learning an instrument, but even that, it's just trusting that it takes little steps every day and and just getting really into each person's individual journey, which again, I will also say my philosophy is I am a biographer, not a historian, and it's comforting for me to just take it down to like one person at a time, one event at a time. And some of that is like my need to like aggressively be in the moment is also a little bit escapist, but it is also very helpful and grounding and full of hope.
Mm.
And I guess for me, where I find hope is kind of in the fact that I can choose every day to share kindness with others, and that those relationships have ripples. That's where I find it. That my theology is I am created to love and to be loved. And so the more loving I can be, the more I become that image of God who created me. And that ultimately wins. That is the fabric that is part of everything. And so, things may seem tough, and it may suck in the meantime, and there is a lot of pain, but that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is love wins. And Rob Bell wrote a whole book about that, but it's true. Love wins for my theology. And that's what I have hope in.
Amen.
And I'm not actually that pessimistic, but like so much of that choosing not to succumb to misery being a profound act of hope. That narrative has gotten rewritten so many times to be like, have a baby to be another soldier to fight communism.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. No doubt. Absolutely. There's definitely a toxic.
And also that, like that, those conversations you and I both tried to start of like, so we might be on the verge of nuclear war. maybe we should talk about that. And then having so many baby boomers be like, oh, this ain't nothing. Yeah, and like, guys, remember that the real only difference between this and the W. Bush years right after 9/11 is that we're on the other end of the missile.
My only point is that there are ways in which we express hope in spite of ourselves, perhaps, without even realizing it, expecting for a future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I apologize for being grumpy.
I didn't hear it that way. I thought it was a good point, honestly, because it's
Yeah.
privilege. You're right. I mean, what I heard your challenge as was, well, Andrew, that's very privileged. I mean, you got to plan your child, right? Not everybody gets to do that. You get to have a job that you find fulfilling. Not everybody gets to do that. I mean, it's what I said, devoid of any critique, is quite privileged, and I believe it. But at the end of the day, it maybe needs a little help.
Yeah.
So.
And I appreciate, Wesley, that you're voicing that, 'cause not to get like meta, but like it was interesting because it was this moment of like, we all talked about hope, the end, and then I kind of love that this is like actually like because it is it is important to also hold both. So as I try to like circle this toward an ending of the episode, I guess an example for the listeners who are all hopefully still listening to this conversation is that it's okay. You can do both. Like,
Amen.
Balance.
You can do both. Like, do not think that having hope, when things are like you can have hope and also let things be crap.
If faith and doubt walk the same path, then I would say hope and fear walk the same path too. That in the same way as you cannot have faith without doubt, you cannot have hope without fear. Otherwise, you
that's
just have
really good.
Yeah,
I love that. Yeah, that's all about finding the balance.
absolutely.
Dear listener, we hope that you that you enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you found it meaningful. As we move forward into the unknown future, boy, that sounded a little preachy, mea culpa, but I didn't know what else to say. So as we move forward into the unknown future, we hope that you will find ways of hoping and of expressing faith and finding mystery, and having a relationship with the divine as you find it in the faces of other people.
Maybe so.
And the rest is left as an exercise for the listener.
Amen.
Bye.